Okay, Hillary, so here is part two of, I don't know how many episodes we'll have on this regarding my memories of your maternal grandparents and relatives, where hopefully I fill in some gaps for you. Continue on the theme of World War II. By the way, I should mention before I get started that in the previous video, I had misspelled your Oma's name. It's not E-L-I-N-O-R. It is E-L-L-I-N-O-R. And if I had the time and inclination to redevelop that video and upload it, I'd make that change, but I'll just make it here. And she was not ever, well, I don't say ever, but she was always called Lova. So that was the diminutive of Ellinor. And of course, that's your middle name. And that's just one more curse your mom and I put on you because nobody knows how to pronounce it right. I'm sure when you graduated from college and law school, they said, bum, 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 Hillary Lore Nye, or Hillary Lore Johnson. So it's always been Lore, but of course it's Lova after your Oma. So anyway, that little tidbit, and speaking of lore, I'm just going to go back into some World War II stories, and I even have a little cheat sheet I made just in case I forget stuff, because that's what old people do. So anyway, we were back somewhere in Poznan, and I think when your mom and Aki were twins, born February 5th, 1944, and at that time, the Russian front was still some miles away, actually quite a few miles away from Poznan, and here's a map from the internet showing where the Russian troops were as of December 44. So this would have been when Aki and Hito were like 8 months old. And you can see that Riga and Poznan were still quite a bit of ways away. But people were beginning to suspect that the war was not going well, despite all the Nazi propaganda. And but things started panicking. I mean, the trouble with the news, probably then as now, is that it was always rosy, and the German troops were doing great, and a lot of the harsh news was being kept from the German people. So when it suddenly occurred to everybody they had to flee, it was a mass panic, and everybody headed towards the train stations, your Oma included, with Hans and Elfie and the two twins in a baby carriage, and they could never get in the train. The train, it would fill up with people heading further west into, Berlin and beyond, but they could never get in because the swarms of people were always getting in their way. And so here's the good guy SS story. I remember your Oma telling me this with great satisfaction, that we shouldn't just always lump people together. There was this SS officer noticing what was happening to your Oma and your parents, Hita and Aki and Elfie and Hans. So he pulled out his gun and shot it in the air, and people jumped back. And he said, before anybody gets into this train, these people are going first. So he made sure that everybody made way, at gunpoint, to let them get on the train. I think it was one of the very last ones to leave Posen. And although eventually, after walking across much of Poland, the Russian army did catch up with them. Who knows what would have happened, in those initial days when the Russian troops swarmed into Posen. And so I'm not sure how long this trek went through Poland and how many times they might have caught a ride on a truck, but my impression is it was all on foot. And, oops, I'm bumping the table and making this jiggle. Sorry about that. So here's another map of where the lines were as of March of 1945. And at this point, it was, that previous thing was December of 44. By March of 45, in other words, when the twins are just a little over a year old, Poznan had been completely occupied, and that was Glenna just floating by in there. And so it had to be in that brief period. I mean, it must have been sort of in the fall and in winter of 44, 45 when that was going on. At one point, they were being shot at by American airplanes. At one point, here's one story that your Oma told me with great poignancy. People would often get, horrible gastrointestinal problems, dysentery and the like, typhoid fever and so on. And at one point, all the kids were sick except I think Hans. And the doctor looked at the kids and he turned to your Oma and said, you can forget, basically he said in words to the effect of, you can forget about Elfie and Aki, they're not going to make it. And he was pretty blunt about it. And so she, shortly thereafter, came upon a farmhouse where this woman took pity on her, and this, again, it was the poor people who helped out more than the rich people. That's something Oma always kept saying. If you want help, don't ask a rich person, ask a poor person. Anyway, this peasant woman came out with this great thick black bread, Russian type black bread, and she fed Aki and Elfie with that, and they recovered. And she attributes it to just the fact that they had that bread that was so fortifying and helped stop them up. So that was another food story from World War II. I should also add, during World War II, people just about everywhere worked in the war effort, just as in the United States, and the women had an important role. And your Oma worked for the welfare system. It was called, I think, Wohlfahrt something, welfare. So she would make the point to me at various times that, you read the American, British versions of what happened in Nazi Germany. And she said two things about living during that time. She said, first of all, it wasn't pervasive. You didn't feel like the Nazis were everywhere and you're constantly getting slogans and speeches and flags and signs. A lot like East Germany was. That was full of all that crap everywhere. And she said life just kept on. You didn't necessarily notice anything except every now and then a broadcast on the radio or a public speaking system, or certainly during air raids. But she said the welfare system was like nothing ever before or after. She said it was efficient, it was fair, no one cheated. So she was very impressed with how the Nazis provided aid for bombed out families and widows and orphans and so on. So, take that for what you will. She thought that system was good and she was part of it. And, she was helping human beings in a bad time. So when they were marching across Poland, I forgot how far they got before the Russian army caught up with them. But the big fear, and a very legitimate fear, was that the Russian soldiers were almost, you could even say they were on orders by Stalin to rape and kill wherever they felt like it and to pillage. And a lot of these soldiers coming into the front lines into Germany were from Mongolia. They were not ethnic Russians. And I remember one of your grandparents' relatives told me, said there were officers who were Russian in charge of these Mongolian hordes who actually even apologized to the occupied Germans, saying this is not how we Russians would be doing this. And these Mongolian guys would have about 8 or 9 watches on their forearm, and they'd say uri, which is the German word for watch. They were fascinated with watches. They'd never seen them before, and they'd never seen indoor plumbing before. So they were let loose by Stalin as a form of revenge for all of the horrible things the Germans did to the Russian people. So it was sort of tit for tat. But the way, and almost somehow linked up with Tanta Lala, and they would, as a defensive mechanism, when Russians would appear, they would grab a baby, any baby, certainly Aki and Hita, but anybody else was available, and they'd pinch them to make them cry. Because the Russian soldiers, as vicious as they were also highly sentimental about little children. And so the greatest protection against rape was to have a baby cry. By the way, there's a really good German movie called, I wrote it down, A Woman in Berlin, Eine Frau in Berlin. I highly recommend you're seeing this if you want to get a flavor of what it was like immediately after the Russian soldiers came in Berlin and occupied the place and how they behaved, both good and bad. It's an interesting story. And I think the German title actually is Anonymous Ones, a woman in Berlin. So it's Anonyme dash eine Frau in Berlin. Strongly recommended. So they avoided being killed and raped by that strategy, and a lot of times they would just hide and hope the Russians would go by. And one of the weird things in Berlin, you have a lot of aunts and uncles in Germany who are simply family friends, and they magically become aunt and uncles. And one of them was a Tante Aya. And when I was in Berlin in 64, 65, I frequently went to her house where she made me these incredible meals. And her son Kuno and I did a lot of stuff together. That's for, I think, the next video, when I'll talk about all the aunts and uncles and cousins you have had in then East Germany and all the things I did with them. And you may still remember Ingrid and Volkmar from having visited Vashon. But I saw Ingrid on a regular basis in Berlin. But I'm jumping ahead. So as I mentioned in the previous video, one of the problems, that was pervasive everywhere is nobody knew where anybody was. People often didn't know if their father, brother, son was still alive on the Eastern Front, and the people on the Eastern Front didn't know where their, displaced families were going, so it was just a matter of chaos. And I remember this story from your mother, also from Tante Aya, the same woman who, was my benefactress in Berlin whenever I was hungry. She gets a letter, Laura, your Oma, gets a letter from Tante Aya from Berlin. And it's just, they've settled now in an area, I think, near Frankfurt called Bad Nauheim, where for a while the family stays until they finally go to America. But anyway, she gets this letter somewhere. I don't know how the letter even worked or how the postal services work, but she gets this letter from Tante Aya. And she's going, blah, blah, blah. We did this and we did this. Oh, yeah. And Ilmar dropped by and left us some sausages. And she just went nuts. She saw this passing sentence in this letter about how Ilmar had dropped by and left some sausage. And she said, oh, my God, he's alive. He's well. So she immediately took off for Berlin, and they got together again. And that must have been quite a reunion. And I believe they had another reunion like this during the war and now this is for sure garbled, but here's my garbled memory, is somehow your Oma was in Vienna with the kids and Ilmar was on a rare leave, and so they somehow got together in Berlin and had some time together while someone took care of the kids. Now that's probably 19% accurate, but that's the story I remember. Well, so anyway, so they get back together again, and they somehow manage to get into Bad Nauheim, again, thanks to his language skills. Always remember, languages will save your life. He spoke enough English to get a job in a PX, an American GI PX, where he had access to miraculous things like nylon stockings and cigarettes. And the GIs were very generous. They paid him, I'm sure, a minimum kind of wage. But he'd come home with these gifts, and that was money then. There was no German mark yet. I think the German economy only started becoming viable again when West Germany was formed, as when East Germany was formed in 1949. But from 45 to 49, people actually were starving in Germany, 46 and 47. Again, your Oma would remind me over and over again that the hardest part of the war was the first 2 years after the war, when there just wasn't any food, and of course the occupying powers were probably still full of vengeance. The way the British treat the POWs, including your Opa, was horrendous and would probably be considered criminal today. So as you know the story about the family that was going to be going to America, the last minute was denied the departure on a program supported by the Lutheran Church, and especially in this case, the Minnesota, where these DPs, displaced persons, could be given homes in America and a new life. Well, someone came up to your Opa while he's working at its PX, and he said, would you like to go to America? But you got to make up your mind, because you have to go in like 3 days or that day. Anyway, it was really immediate. So he had to go home. They had to immediately decide that they were going to America, like in the next day. I mean, it was 2 days. And the original family slotted for this. Somebody in that family had tuberculosis, so they were dropped the last minute. So they got on the ship, which I believe was called the Beagle, and it was an old troop ship. And going across the Atlantic, everyone got really ill. I think your mom especially, everyone was throwing up. And they were stacked in these bunk beds, several stacked up high in very close quarters. It was meant for troops. But they got on that ship and arrived in New York. And when they arrived in New York, because of the other family set up to be received, a CBS radio had someone there to interview the family. And of course, it became the Von Mendy family. And hopefully that recording still exists. I remember Poppy brought out a record. I think it was a 78 RPM record, and played this interview. And in editing it, they had to sub in somebody else's voice for your Oma, and I can't remember why. So you hear this interview. How do you like America? And what do you got in your suitcase? I mean, it's just kind of banal stuff of these people who showed up with nothing. And I think Aki chimes in at one point with some cute little thing, and Hans, says some stuff. Anyway, I hope that recording exists. I asked Hans, and he said he might still have that. If so, we'll digitize that and make this part of your record. So I think I'm beginning to run out of time here. Jesus, already 16 minutes. Anything? Yeah, so I think Tante Lala lived with him for a while in Bad Nauheim, and they were in close quarters, I think, in the upper floor of had some kind of duplex. Again, I think Hita Hans and Alfie have better recollections. So I think I'm going to wrap this up with this. I will talk more about, let me just see. Yeah, I think I covered most of that. Well, yeah, one final thing. When they finally do wind up in Owatonna, Minnesota, you got these kids who can only speak German, yet they quickly pick up in English. And when my brother Paul and Jesse went to see some old spots in Minnesota and Iowa back in 2005, we stopped at what I'm pretty sure is the house that was the house they lived in Owatonna, Minnesota. And that was where they eventually made their way to St. Louis Park when the kids became college and high school age. It was a hard time. Your Oma had to work sewing in a factory of some kind where she sewed things until her fingers nearly bled. And I think your Opa worked in some kind of insurance thing where eventually he got a job in an insurance company in Minneapolis, where he got to know a woman named Paulette Volz, who is also the sister of a law school student, co-student named Joan Volz in my class. So it was almost inevitable that Aki would meet this Paulette Volz and marry her. But anyway, I think I better call it quits for now. This is going to be another long one, and hopefully this helps. And be sure to check out the family website that Brother Paul and I have put together with many of our family stories. And check out this URL to take a look at them. There's quite a few there, and worth a look. You can click on the link in the description below.